Good morning, class. This is the ECON 512 Introduction to International Trade class. Today is February 17th, Thursday. The class will move on to Chapter 6 of your textbook. The topic of Chapter 6 is the gains and cost of tariffs, the government trade policy. So here are the topics of today's discussion. Number 1, tariffs, introduction to tariffs. Number 2, evaluating the gains from trade. 3, international trade and welfare cost of tariffs. 4, the shipping container. 5, who gains the foreign direct investment. 6, trade and increasing returns from the actual evidence. Here are the video clips.
We will discuss mainly tariffs and how they influence economies of small versus large countries. We start with the operation and effects of import tariffs and transition to export tariffs, specific tariffs, ad valorem tariffs, and compound tariffs. We will explore the effective rate of tariff protection and the process of tariff escalation. Then we will turn over to postponing import duties via bonded warehouses and foreign trade zones. Finally, we will discuss these ideas together in the framework of the political economy of protectionism. The small Spanish town of Tarifa is sometimes credited with being the origin of the word tariff, since it was the first port in history to charge merchants for the use of its docks. Other sources credit the origin of the word tariff to an Italian word tarifa, translated as the list of prices, book of rates. Today, tariffs are collected as a tax by governments regulating the activities of foreign companies that ship their goods to import docks. As you read this chapter and watch the video, you will understand how tariff taxes are calculated, levied, and collected, and who gets the benefits of the revenues accumulated. One founding message I want you to make sure to grasp fully concerning tariffs is who ultimately pays for all tariffs. It is you and me, as consumers. When a tariff is placed on goods imported from somewhere like China, it increases the cost of those tariff-taxed goods for you and me when we purchase them. If the good costs less in our markets even after the tariff is placed on it, then we purchase that good and the tariff fee is collected by the U.S. federal government. Does anyone really look to discover how those funds are spent? It was not paid by the exporting country. It was paid by you and me as consumers. Keep this active in your thoughts as you progress through this chapter. It is fundamental to understanding the effects of tariffs and who ultimately pays for them. The study of economics puts us into the dual realm of understanding the mechanisms of creating goods and services to generate sustainable profits, while also analyzing the behaviors and interactions of the people involved. We often use the term welfare as a measure of advances or declines to a nation caused by an economic activity. Economists believe that free trade has positive welfare benefits to the greatest number of people because the cost of goods and services is lowered by broad competition factors at the production level. Policymakers often look specifically for the benefits and losses for their constituents. They are elected officials who want to be re-elected. The movement of government policies along the spectrum between protectionism and trade liberalization keeps shifting either to one extreme or the other, an economy moving in the direction of autarky or free trade. Global events over the past couple centuries have initiated governments to launch trade policies all along this spectrum. Simply put, a tariff is a tax levied on a good as it crosses national boundaries. These are commonly levied by nations when products enter a country and are called import tariff. Less common is the export tariff, levied and collected by the selling company's nation. Export tariffs were categorically prohibited by the U.S. Constitution in 1776. Internationally, export tariffs are rare because they penalize domestic producers and stifle economic activity. Tariffs, also called trade taxes, can be grouped into protective and revenue-generating categories by virtue of the function they serve. Tariffs are protective when they are imposed to increase the cost of foreign-made goods as they enter a domestic marketplace, to protect domestic producers against lower costs of import-competing offshore producers. Tariffs serve the function of creating additional revenues and are imposed by governments as a means of collecting capital on either imported or exported goods. In the USA, from 1789 through the first half of the 19th century, revenue tariffs accounted for over 90% of the federal budget. Politicians wanted a straightforward tax that was not too onerous and was easy to collect. Today, only 1% of federal revenues come from tariffs. As a group, developing nations rely more on tariff revenues than the economically developed countries of the world. Several types of tariffs are collected on imported goods entering the U.S. Sometimes the duty is applied to a general type of good, like a broom, and sometimes it is a specific part of a complex device, like a transmission shaft. Tariffs are applied at various stages of a product's assembly. The entire process accumulates taxes at various stages of product manufacture. The simplest duty collected is a specific tariff, a fee based on the number of homogeneous commodity units imported. It might be some fee per pound or per item, like 15 cents per shirt. When applied to a group of highly cost-variable goods like automobiles, the final penalty collected to protect the domestic industry manufacturing the same good becomes inversely related as prices drop. This means, for instance, a $5,000 specific tariff may be applied on imported cars valued from $50,000 to $15,000. In the former case, the tariff adds 10% to the total cost, but with the latter, the duty represents a 33% cost increase. During an economic recession, when lower-cost goods are favored by the marketplace, a specific tariff will provide greater protection for domestic manufacturers. Buyers will favor the lower-cost item, even if it was hit with a 33% price increase as it enters the domestic market. The specific tariff provides inverse protection during an economic growth spurt, when consumers are attracted to higher-cost or luxury item goods, as an imported item's price is taxed at a lower rate than cheaper goods. Ad valorem tariffs impose a set percentage of the value of imported goods as a tax when delivered to the domestic market. This tariff maintains a constant degree of protection for domestic producers in all economic patterns. As price of a good increases, so does the total tax collected. If the ad valorem tariff is 10% and the value of the item rises from $200 to $300, the duty collected increases by $10. Disagreements between the importer and the customs agency arise as the imported item's value, and therefore its taxable burden, is determined in what is called a customs valuation. determined by a customs agent, and can be challenged by importers based on disagreement of a determined value. The item's value is intended to reflect the commodity's worth at the import dock, not at a retailer's site or point of secondary processing. These customs valuations are often a topic of contention. Policies dictate how value is determined as the status when it left the host country port, free on board or FOB, or if the commodity's price reflects its value when it arrives at the U.S. port, therefore including cost insurance freight or CIF, making a striking difference in the duties being collected. FOB is generally used by U.S. customs agents, while CIF is common in Europe. Compound tariffs are the combination of specific tariffs levied on raw materials and ad valorem tariffs on manufactured products. These may be collected as duties on woven fabrics, such as a specific tariff collected to compensate U.S. fabric manufacturers, while the ad valorem tariff provides protection for markets of woven fabrics. Their combination may be intricate, clouding one-way interpretation of the full tax burden. Tariff rates around the world average about 3%. Some goods are traded within a free trade zone, thus no tariff is collected, while other countries tax imports at much higher rates. As you see lists like this one, consider for yourself, why is the Bahamas levying such high tariffs on the goods it imports for their consumers to purchase? Those taxes increase the cost of imported goods made available for domestic purchase. Why is their government penalizing citizens like that? Tariffs in each country can be considered in terms of nominal and effective rates. A nominal tariff rate is the published duty on the finished product as it enters the country of destination. These tariffs are for completed products, ready for retail trade. It is the shoes in a box, the backpack in a bag. It is the final product ready to be put on the shelf you buy it from. Effective tariff rates take into consideration nominal tariff rates in addition to the duties collected on imported component parts of the final product. Effective protection reflects tariff rates across the spectrum of component parts of the final manufactured unit. This concept implies that the nominal tariff rates of partially finished goods are compounded as the item progresses through final stages of completion. The effective rate of protection measures how much protection a tariff or other trade policy provides to domestic producers. It shows the change in value added to the production process when trade policies change. Effective rates of protection usually differ from tariff rates because tariffs also affect sectors other than the protected sector, causing ripple effects on prices and value added for the protected sectors. We can determine the effective rate of protection for Dell computers by finding the nominal tariff rates on the product's components, in this case 10%. About 80% of Dell computer components are manufactured offshore, then imported to the U.S. for final assembly. Here we are looking at a free trade scenario, so there is a 0% nominal tariff applied. This shows a 50% effective protection rate for Dell. By extension of these findings, it means that Dell does not have to bear the burden of 50% of the costs for their final product, which would be levied otherwise. This gives Dell a price advantage in the domestic market over non-protected companies. Take a look at this comparison of effective tariff rate protections in two industries to evaluate the resulting end price results. Sometimes these benefits are targeted at benefiting domestic producers. In other cases, they are intended to discourage foreign products, which generates revenue for the domestic government. Look at Table 4.5. Where do you estimate the marketplace tax burdens on forestry products are directed? Why did China develop a domestic effective tariff protection rate of 9.2% on fiberboard, but 26.6% on moldings? Who is the intended beneficiary of these tariff policies? Consider for yourself who benefits. The effective rate of protection is commonly used to explain the net effect of trade policies on the specifically addressed incentives delivered by domestic governments. The measurement of effective protection is a two-stage process. First, determining the nominal protection of the policies in question, and second, analyzing the effective protection for different firms, sectors, or activities. Figuring out who receives the larger protection through trade tariffs can be challenging. Increases in effective protection induces companies to seek domestically produced supplies, even when their domestic costs are higher than their opportunity costs through free trade. A foreign-made good may be less expensive than a domestically produced good, but when the nominal tariff of that particular good is charged, it may become more expensive. When taken in their entirety, the benefits can appear to be upside down as viewed by unbenefited domestic producers. A producer of a different component for the final product may not receive protection from import tariffs, leaving the less favored producer in a disadvantaged position. Overall, it may be understood that tariffs are levied to protect a certain industry, but individual components of goods may receive mixed protection. Tariff escalation refers to situations when tariffs are low on raw materials but increase as the product undergoes additional processing by an exporter. This protects importing country processing industries and discourages processing activities in raw material countries where they originate. Globally, the difference between raw materials tariff rates and processed product tariff rates are noticeable. There is also a steeper tariff differential for agricultural products compared to industrial products. Understanding the effect and intent of tariff escalation, what would you estimate to be the implications of the differences in rates charged in these two categories? Why does Japan charge 4.5% on raw agricultural products, but 10.9% on processed agricultural merchandise? But at the same time, 0.5% on primary industrial products, but 1.9% on processed industrial parts. Which industries are receiving the greatest benefits in the Japanese economy from trade policies? What about in other countries? How do you interpret what this information tells you? Businesses within developed countries are expected to seek strategies to optimize profits by seeking lowest cost providers from locations around the globe. This comes under the category of outsourcing and offshore assembly. Initiated near the end of the Great Depression, the United States Tariff Act of 1930 created the Offshore Assembly Provisions Act, or OAP, to provide incentives for foreign manufacturers to buy processed components from the USA as part of their final assembly efforts. For the U.S. consumer, it means that goods assembled abroad using U.S. manufactured components receive preferential tariff treatment upon re-entry into the United States.
So all of us that came to San Pedro this morning came here because there's one present that just wouldn't fit under the Christmas tree. And we are so excited that it has arrived. Today, just a few hours after the Christmas festivities ended here in Southern California, Los Angeles had the pleasure of welcoming the largest ship to ever visit the United States of America. This is the largest ship to ever dock anywhere in the United States, the CMA CGM Benjamin Franklin. This ship is called the Benjamin Franklin because it embodies the relationship that has existed between our nation and France. And this company, which is French-based in Marseille, and the United States have for so long had such a close relationship, and our very first ambassador to France was Benjamin Franklin. And here we have this great French ambassador visiting America and repaying the favor.
Tax evasion is illegal, but tax avoidance is a sign of good cost management skills. When considering tariffs as a form of taxation, this topic strikes at the core of many business management strategies. Our textbook gives a couple examples worth exploring of each tariff cost situation. It can be inconceivable to spend energy, time, and resources to erase a tax burden, but if the tax penalty is substantial enough, the mitigating efforts may be worth the hassle. Consider your own anticipated industry to determine how these approaches could affect your business management decisions.
How you doing? Can you come in for a second, please? Hi. Do you have a match?
No smoking in here.
I'm not going to smoke. No, I'm going to smoke when I go outside. Thank you very much. Thank you. Is your supervisor here?
Yeah, he's in the office.
Can you go get him for me, please?
What's the problem?
Are you security here?
Yeah.
Then you're the
Problem.
problem. Go get your supervisor, please. Now. Now!
Hey.
Can I help you? Are you the supervisor here?
Yes, who are you?
I'm Inspector Raff of the United States Customs Service. Has all this stuff passed through customs already?
No, this is the bonded area.
Well, then tell me something. Answer a question for me. How can a black man, dressed like me, just march into your warehouse, walk into the bonded area, and start poking around without anyone asking me any questions whatsoever?
Well, I don't know.
Well, thank you. That's the answer I was looking for. Why don't you guys just give me your ID numbers, because somebody's going to lose their job behind this. This guy gave me a match, for Christ's sake.
Ooh, you gave him a match?
Listen to me. I do security checks all over the nation. And with the exception of Cleveland, this place has the worst security in the nation. Now, I suggest you guys call your wives, because we're going to be here all night. We're going to check the background of each and every crate in this section, starting with this one right here.
It has been said that the best tax is one someone else pays, but the second best tax is one you can delay payment on. Bonded warehouses are the type of facility where imported items can be stored, manipulated, or undergo manufacturing operations without payment of duties. It may be managed by a state or by private enterprises. In the latter case, a customs bond must be posted with the host government. Bonded warehouses exist in all developed countries of the world. When goods are placed in the bonded warehouse, the importer and warehouse proprietor incur a liability under a bond to the customs agent. This liability is generally canceled when the goods are either exported, deemed exported, withdrawn for supplies to a vessel or aircraft in international traffic, deployed under customs supervision, or withdrawn for consumption domestically after payment of the duty. Only the portion of the imported items leaving the duty-free zone for retail sales or domestic manufacturing are subject to the tariff fees. The rest of it re-exits the U.S. or is destroyed, tariff tax free. In the U.S., the Foreign Trade Zones Act of 1934 created customs-related advantages and exemptions from local and national taxes. In other countries, they are called special economic zones or free trade zones, and were formerly called free ports or export processing zones. Foreign trade zones range from specific purpose manufacturing facilities to areas where legal systems and economic regulations vary from the normal provisions of the country concerned. In those zones, customs duties and other taxes are reduced or eliminated, and many regulations for registration of businesses are streamlined. Foreign trade zones are intended to foster economic activity and domestic employment with value-added benefits, while avoiding the payment of tariffs until the good is sold to a domestic consumer. In foreign trade zones, imported origin goods may be landed, handled, manufactured or reconfigured, and re-exported without the intervention of customs authorities. Only when the goods are moved to consumers within the subject country, where the zone is located, do they become subject to the prevailing customs duties. In the U.S., these are organized around major seaports, international airports, and along international borders with Canada and Mexico.
To focus on the other side of the border, the north of our border right now, where the president is looking at a tariff on Canadian lumber, but it is looking like a trade war to some Canadians. Jeff Locke with the latest on that. Jeff?
Speaking of negotiating tactics, maybe that's what's going on here, Neil. Indeed, we spent yesterday with those dairy farmers that are kind of getting screwed by Canada and the shutdown to the Canadian market for U.S. producers. Well, the president struck back. Take a look at the presidential tweet this morning. He said Canada's made business for our dairy farmers in Wisconsin and other border states very difficult, like New York as well, not just Wisconsin. Chuck Schumer and Donald Trump on the same side of that issue. He says, we will not stand for this. Watch. But what they're watching right now is a 20% tariff on Canadian softwood lumber. What the heck is that? Well, if you go into Home Depot, buy yourself a 2x4, that would be Canadian softwood lumber more likely than not, because a lot of it comes from Canada. The tariff would be retroactive to 90 days, which would get a little extra sting to Canada for it, and it would be to offset the subsidies the U.S. government says Canada puts on its lumber. Here's how that works. In Canada, most of the lumber is logged from forests that are owned by the provinces. They give the Canadian loggers kind of a break on the cost. Here in the U.S., lumber companies often own the land themselves, and if they pay for government lands to log on government lands, they don't get really much of a break on it. And so they're trying to level the playing field if they can.
Canadian Minister of Natural Resources reacting to those new tariffs.
This present round is the fifth time Canada has had to defend its softwood lumber industry against U.S. claims over the last 30 years. Independent trade panels have repeatedly found these claims to be baseless. We have prevailed in the past, and we will do so again.
If you do a lot of business with each other, there are going to be irritants. And that's what is happening between Canada and the United States. To give us a little bit of a sense of proportion, it's worth bearing in mind that softwood lumber exports, that's one of the issues, are only 2% of Canada's total exports to the United States. And dairy, another issue, is less than half a percentage point of the United States' total exports to Canada. So these are irritants. They're serious issues, absolutely. But we have to really not lose sight of the bigger picture, which is a strong, robust, mutually beneficial relationship.
In terms of these tariffs, though, I mean, they wouldn't call them irritants, the people who are involved in this, the Canadian and Canadian businesses that are involved in this. In terms of those irritants, are you prepared to fight back? Will Canada retaliate in any way, shape, or form?
So softwood lumber is a long-standing issue between Canada and the United States. This is actually known as Lumber 5. It's our fifth round of this dispute, and we absolutely will defend our industry. Our view is that these tariffs, that the U.S. allegations that somehow we're subsidizing our industry, our view is that's simply wrong. And in the past, on every occasion when we have taken the Commerce Department to court, we have won at every level. At the WTO, at NAFTA, the rulings have always been in Canada's favor. And I'm confident that that will be the case in this dispute as well. And in the meantime, negotiations are ongoing, and I hope that we'll be able to reach a settlement.
The term tariff is presented in this class as a form of a tax levied by a government. When a tariff is applied to a foreign-made good, its price to domestic consumers increases. On the price side of the equation, foreign-made products will only appear in domestic markets if the combination of price and quality give the upper hand to the foreign good, if it can be sold for less than a comparable domestic product. Otherwise, the foreign producer would not attempt to enter our domestic market in the first place. Domestically produced goods face competition from imported goods in the domestic market, and tariffs are a means used by politicians to make the domestically produced good competitive on a cost basis in our local markets. When tariffs are applied to imported goods, the product price increases for consumers, while domestic producers of the same good benefit from a comparatively lower cost product. Consumer perceptions about quality between producer products may be to the advantage of either manufacturer. In the balance, consumers pay more for the subject products, and the government generates some cash for the general fund. With that general overview of tariff effects, we can look deeper at the topic of tariffs, starting with an example of two different-sized nations entering into the trade relationship to consider such concepts as consumer surplus and producer surplus. Earlier, we mentioned the concept of welfare as indicating society's status being better or worse off. With this in mind, let's extend the ideas to understanding consumer surplus and producer surplus. Consumer surplus is considered from the demand side and represents the difference between the amount buyers would be willing and able to pay for a good and the actual amount they do pay. You may be able and willing to pay $4 per gallon for gasoline for your car, but today you paid $2 per gallon. Your consumer surplus on the purchase is $2 per gallon, and your total surplus would be multiplied by the number of gallons purchased. If you filled it up for 15 gallons, your total surplus hit $30. That works for the single consumer example. We can expand that to a group of buyers. We take a look at this scenario to see the maximum price consumers as a group are able and willing to pay, $4 per gallon, and the current equilibrium price being offered in the market is $2. The consumer pays $8 and gets 4 gallons. The consumer was willing to pay as much as $4 per gallon, but their demand would have been moderated because of the price difference. In fact, they would have only purchased about nothing at a maximum price of $4 per gallon. When we look at the downward sloping demand curve and the equilibrium price, we determine consumers would have spent $12 as shown by the area of DECBAD. Consumer surplus in this example is the area of ABC and is $4, calculated as 2 times 4 divided by 2, in the area of the shaded triangle. Market price will affect the quantity of gas purchased and the level of consumer surplus enjoyed. Producer surplus uses the same concepts in reverse, coming to us on the supply side. Producer surplus is the difference between what they are willing to receive for a commodity and the actual amount they do receive. Continuing our example of gasoline sales, from the producer standpoint, surplus is the area above the curve and below the market price. At a cost of $2 per gallon and 4 gallons supplied, revenue totals $8. The minimum amount they must receive is their total variable cost of B, C, D. Producer surplus in this case is the difference between what they received and their total variable cost, or $8 minus $4, netting the producer $4. As market equilibrium price increases, producer surplus will increase or drop as prices are lowered. Producer and consumer surplus discussions are used to explain the effect of import tariffs and their impact on a nation's net welfare.
It was a thoughtful and substantive conversation, and it will go on for a while, and in the end, we're all going to win. Both countries, we're all going to win. Are you ready? We will build a great wall along the southern border. And Mexico will pay for the wall. 100%.
Individual consumers in moderately large markets are price takers, meaning they lack market power to negotiate the terms of trade with sellers. It is the same with small nations entering the arena of world competition. Here, we take a look at supply and demand curve intersection for a small nation producing automobiles at point E, where 50 automobiles are sold domestically for $9,500 each, determined by the supply and demand curves intersection. If the country opens to foreign trade from a large nation, new supply will be seen as a perfectly elastic horizontal line at $8,000. Because the small nation's influence on world prices would be negligible. The free trade equilibrium is found at point F, where 80 automobiles are domestically purchased. This lowered the domestic production from the pre-trade level of 50 automobiles to 20, and an import of 60 automobiles from foreign producers. Free trade results in a lowering of the price for domestically produced automobiles and the number domestically produced. The domestic automobile industry is stifled by reductions in producer surplus. On the other hand, consumers are made better off with sizable consumer surplus benefits. Consider how a small nation's auto industry faces the challenges of job losses and falling revenues. The nation's political leadership may impose a protective tariff of $1,000 on automobile imports, increasing its domestic price to $9,000. This brings the demand down to 60 automobiles total, with 40 produced locally and 20 from foreign sources. Because of the small nation's status, the supply curve remains elastic and the full tariff burden is transferred to the domestic consumer. Before the tariff was levied, the consumer surplus was the area above the horizontal supply line and below the demand curve. With the tariff, consumer surplus falls by the area lost between the elastic supply line and below demand. Let's break it down some more. In terms of the nation's net welfare in the post-tariff condition, most domestic jobs are retained along with price supports for the manufacturer, and the federal government generates new revenues. But consumer surplus is reduced. We dissect this chart to find the magnitude of specific effects. On the chart, the area C found between the elastic supply lines and between the quantity sold by foreign versus domestic suppliers is the revenue effect. These funds were first allocated to consumers as surplus, but are now redirected to the government in the form of tariff collections. We call that a government surplus effect. The area shown in A is another transfer of surplus, once allocated to consumers, that is now transferred to auto producers and called the redistributive effect. Moving along this range of tariff effects, we look at Area B and how the initially increased consumer surplus is reallocated to the process of a protective effect. This area is below the domestic supply curve and bounded by the elastic international supply lines, before and after the tariff. It shows us a net loss of welfare because of the less efficient domestic production receiving support from consumer purchases from the tariff's inflated rate. Opposing the protective effect area is the consumption effect, Area D. On the chart, this region shows us how purchases of automobiles domestically are reduced from 80 to 60 units, and costs are increased by $1,000 each. We can consider this as an artificial modification to consumer free choice imposed in the form of a trade tariff. When the protective effect and the consumption effect are combined, we consider them to be the deadweight loss of the tariff on the domestic economy. Quite a few different factors can result in deadweight loss, not just tariffs. These are also known as excess burdens or allocative inefficiencies. They indicate a loss of economic efficiency, witnessed when equilibrium price and quantity for a good or service is not achieved because of artificial manipulation of a market. Winners and losers are easily seen in this small nation import example. Consumer surplus is enhanced by free trade and reduced by the imposition of the tariff. Fees collected by the government are reallocated to different beneficiaries, including the domestic producers and the government itself. Now we take a different slant on the free trade example to explore what happens to welfare effects when a large country initiates trade with another large country.
The United States is not only the world's largest economy, it is also the greatest consumer of foreign-made goods. About half of what we buy are clothing, toys, pharmaceuticals, cars, vegetables, you name it, comes from another country. Processing these goods keeps U.S. Customs and Border Protection very busy at our nation's 326 ports of entry. But occasionally, some foreign importers and manufacturers are tempted to cut corners. These shortcuts by foreign manufacturers can be extremely dangerous to the health and safety of the U.S. consumer. This is Inside CBP. Hello, and welcome to Inside CBP. I'm Michael Pope. The foreign importers and manufacturers who attempt to cheat the system of importing their merchandise into the U.S. sometimes send unsafe goods to America that are not up to U.S. standards. These products may be produced under unsanitary conditions, labeled with false or misleading information, or just simply constructed with dangerous and inferior materials. Imported items that do not meet U.S. regulations for safety, like toys with small parts, or lead paint that could be ingested, clothing that is highly flammable, an unsafe part in a power strip or household lighting, or infected personal hygiene products are examples of unsafe imported products here in the U.S. Consider the dangerous consequences if you use any of these unsafe products. This is why import safety is a top priority for the men and women of U.S. Customs and Border Protection.
When we talk about a large nation, we need to put that into the context of what large means. We do not reference the area of the country, or directly the population of the country. Instead, we can say it in reference to the number of people in the large country anticipated to participate in the consumption of the goods introduced from trade. We can introduce the U.S. market as a large nation in reference to opening foreign trade of automobiles. With over 320 million U.S. consumers, the U.S. is a large group of automobile buyers, with an average of 800 vehicles per 1,000 residents. Contrast that with a country like India, with a population of 1.3 billion, but having only 18 motor vehicles per 1,000 residents. That translates into about 10 times more motor vehicles in the U.S. marketplace than in the automotive market of India. In that context, the U.S. is a large nation for that market, but India is a small nation for the same market. Now suppose the U.S. launches a tariff on automobile imports. This has a series of ripple effects within the U.S. A tariff is levied, imported automobile prices increase, consumer surplus decreases, demand decreases, and revenues are shifted to the government. In Japan, a major exporter of automobiles to the U.S., producer surplus decreases and may initiate a price reduction on their part, or at least a reallocation of their commodities shipped to the U.S. consumers. This reallocation may be seen in the form of lower-cost automobiles shipped to the U.S. to moderate the post-tariff effects. The terms of trade overall improves for the U.S. at the expense of Japan. We will now look deeper into the effects of a large nation tariff on automobiles. We start with the autarky equilibrium price at E, where 70 automobiles are demanded at $9,600 each. Because the U.S. is a large market for this commodity, free trade is expected to be seen as an inelastic supply curve. Supply is not a horizontal line. We expect the free trade supply curve to be upward sloping, but slightly more horizontal than a domestic supply curve. With free trade initiated, a new supply curve is introduced, giving a demand curve intersection at F for 110 automobiles at $8,000 each. Of that quantity, about 30 are domestically produced and 80 are imported. Suppose now that the U.S. levies a $1,000 specific tariff on automobiles. This is seen as a supply curve shift to the left, with some of the increase absorbed by Japan's producers and some borne by U.S. consumers, with a new equilibrium found at G. The inelastic supply curve shown here, upward sloping, translates into an automobile cost increase of $800 for domestic consumers and $200 price decrease for Japanese producers. U.S. consumer surplus falls by the area between the price points, bounded by the demand curve and the axis. Just as we saw in the small nation example, this large nation example generates the redistributive effect, deadweight loss, and revenue effect, but their impacts are slightly altered. The redistributive effect reduces consumer surplus as it is transferred to domestic producers. The tariff's deadweight loss, or decrease in consumer welfare, is split between the consumption effect in Area B and the protective effect in Area D. The revenue effect is a combination of areas C and E. Notice the revenue generated comes from both the consumer and the foreign producer, as opposed to the small nation example where the consumer paid the entire tariff burden. In this case, the U.S. terms of trade improves, because the forward-shifting burden of tax fees is partially borne by Japanese suppliers. However, if Japan responds with a retaliatory tariff on U.S. exported automobiles, or any other commodity, these effects might be erased. In this case, the U.S. imports more Japanese vehicles than Japan imports U.S.-made cars. So the impacts may be moderated. As a major importer of Japanese automobiles, the U.S. is in a favorable trade position. The tariff shown here improves the U.S. terms of trade, and therefore, the U.S. consumer surplus and domestic welfare. Keep in mind that the negative welfare effect is seen as a deadweight loss from the protection and consumption effects shown on the graphs we have been studying. National welfare can be managed, but the implementing country needs to understand the impacts of its actions. If gains from improving the terms of trade increases to an extent it is larger than the deadweight loss, there is a net increase in national welfare. On this chart, if the area shown as E increases to an extent it is larger than B plus D combined, we see the net increase in national welfare. If E is equal to B plus D, then national welfare is unchanged. Finally, if the area of E is smaller than the areas B and D, the net national welfare is diminished. The interactions of these factors should be investigated extensively by analysts seeking to provide national benefits from trade policies. If not understood, impacts can inadvertently penalize certain parts of the equation while benefiting others. Remember, think like an economist. Political analysts are intrigued by the idea of an optimal tariff, where the consumption effect combined with the protective effect is less than the gross gains to national welfare, also called the terms of trade. In the last chart, it was where area E is greater than B and D combined. This hypothetical sweet spot can only be found when the foreign elasticity of supply is low, meaning that the amount of the foreign commodity that producers supply to the market is not grossly affected by the price at which they are able to sell the commodity. On the last chart, it is shown as a steeply sloping supply curve. Where the U.S. is a large nation and also a major buyer on the international market for a good, such as steel, a tariff in this situation will shift the tariff burden mostly to the producer of the good, to the benefit of the tariff-imposing nation, the USA. China is a major trading partner with the USA as a steel exporter. The U.S. imposes a tariff on steel imports. The immediate response may be shifting of the small tariff burden onto China, but China may respond with a reverse tariff on U.S. exports to offset the first tax. Retaliation taxes continue between countries until someone realizes that the net worldwide welfare has diminished, and everyone is worse off. This spawned the phrase, beggar thy neighbor, as an economic policy where one country attempts to remedy its economic problems by means that tend to worsen the economic problems of other countries. In rather short order, everyone loses. We take a look at the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. As you watch this clip, try to put the proposed tariffs by President Trump to build the border wall by taxing Mexican-produced goods with a tariff. Think about which conditions would result in Mexican producers paying more than U.S. consumers for the tax fees collected.
States slid into depression. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was one of many policies adopted by President Herbert Hoover. The sharp negative effects that followed came as a shock to the bill's sponsors. It was passed towards the beginning of the Depression, and its proponents, Smoot-Hawley, said it would actually help mitigate unemployment and revive the economy. And of course, the economy just got much worse. Partly that is due to Smoot-Hawley itself. A lot of countries retaliated against the U.S., so that meant U.S. exports fell just as much as U.S. imports did. In fact, exports fell even faster than U.S. imports, so it really added to the contractionary impact on the U.S., and it bred a lot of ill will against the United States. Other countries resented the fact that here was the world's largest economy, a creditor country that was trying to get other countries to repay their debts, and yet we're stopping them from in terms of their ability to repay those debts by earning the dollars that they need to pay back those debts. So other countries resented it. They struck back at the U.S., and the whole world trading system sort of collapsed, in part because of this act.
These outcomes came as no surprise to economists of the day.
1,000 economists wrote to President Herbert Hoover asking him to veto or not to sign the Smoot-Hawley legislation, and he turned them aside. Economists really did predict what would happen. Trade would collapse. There would be increase in trade friction. Other countries would respond to retaliate against U.S. exports. It wouldn't help out farmers at all. And yet it passed. The Depression got worse, and the reputation of Smoot-Hawley just went down the tubes from there.
Smoot-Hawley was just the beginning of a protectionist wave in Congress.
Most farmers were export-oriented. They sold their crops overseas rather than face a lot of import competition. And once Congress got going on this, they raised not only tariffs on agricultural goods, which really didn't help the farmers very much, but on industrial goods as well. And the protectionism just went amok in the U.S.
Since the predictable devastation that Smoot-Hawley brought, most presidents, Democrats and Republicans, have been largely free traders. Franklin Roosevelt inveighed against the act during his first presidential campaign.
Presidents have sort of looked not to any particular section of the country in terms of what their trade interests are, but try to figure out what is the national interest in terms of trade, and have supported trade liberalization, getting other countries to reduce their trade barriers as we reduce ours through the general agreement on tariffs and trade and what have you. And presidents from Democrats from Lyndon Johnson and Bill Clinton to Republicans, Bush and Reagan, have always hearkened back to the days of Smoot-Hawley as a bad thing that Congress did in terms of trade policy, and that we're trying to warn people away from protectionism, the siren song of protectionism, which sort of seems there's this allure that it might help the economy, but really in practice makes things much worse.
We have been covering tariffs as a tax imposed on imported goods. Initially, the burden of the most tariffs are borne by the importing country's consumers and seen as reduced demand in the domestic market at an increased price. Domestic companies making goods that are in direct competition with the imported goods are beneficiaries because their goods are given a price buffer against the lower cost producing foreign company, plus transportation and tariff burdens. Domestic companies enjoy the benefits of lower efficiency and higher prices while still remaining competitive in domestic markets at the expense of consumers. Benefits enjoyed by domestic companies competing against foreign imports reveal only part of the issue. Import tariffs lead to a reduction in the efficiency of the domestic sector, thus to their export potential for competing goods. Losers from the tariff scenario include industries that support foreign imports because of the reduction in demand for the foreign-made goods, and indirectly, domestic exporters because the taxation-supported loss of efficiency of domestic producers. They will export less. Other downstream impacts of the tariff levy are generally recognized when tariffs are applied across many sectors and for extended periods of time. Retaliatory tariffs magnify the loss of global welfare and distribute it to other business sectors. You may have come to this course with some basic feelings about right and wrong economic decisions, or maybe you are forming them as you work through this class. The idea that tariffs deliver a regressive tax burden to the poorest consumers seems absurd. How can it be that the most regressive nation in the world penalizes their poorest consumers? Further on this topic, the U.S. also imposes high tariffs on imports from some of the poorest nations as they supply basic goods to our consumers. What's up with that? We live within a system of tariffs imposed on foreign supplier goods that deliver products to our ports at variable rates of duties. We can look into it to see that initial tariff rates were levied when aggressive protectionist policies were implemented to protect the U.S. textile industry from foreign competition. That protection ultimately failed as manufacturing was moved offshore because of substantially lower production costs than U.S. producers could compete against, even with tariffs in place. Despite the industry's closure in the U.S., the protectionist tariff rates still apply to the lowest cost imported textiles, the clothing most affordable for low-income families, and families trying to stretch their recession-clouded incomes. It is striking that the high-end clothing like sporting shoes, lingerie, and designer dresses have tariff protection significantly lower than tariff rates on the basic types of imported textiles like children's clothes, work shirts, socks, and modest attire worn by students and back-office professionals. It is partially because high-end textile importers can afford and are able to lobby Congress and the President not to impose barriers to their free trade items and remove them when possible. Who is lobbying for the removal of tariffs against textiles from low-cost providers to the U.S.? It has been said that the U.S. has the best politicians money can buy. Well, consider for yourself. What will you do to make the right decisions? We have covered a lot of theoretical ground in this lecture about free trade global welfare effects. In particular, shifting of a duty burden from an importing company to the domestic consumer, and looked at specific examples of unintended penalties through regressive tax delivery systems. International trade gives nations the ability to focus their production in industrial sectors they are best suited to supply, serving their domestic markets and international markets based on their comparative advantages. This leads to globally lower prices and an increase of global welfare. Governments everywhere have launched trade restrictions levied against foreign imports, generally to protect domestic industries and workers. As you read through this section of the chapter, give your attention to specific examples of how the costs associated with collecting the trade duty were shifted to domestic consumers, how national welfare was decreased, and which American industries benefited and which lost. It is nearly impossible to benefit one domestic industry through taxation on a trading partner's goods without penalizing a different domestic industry. Imports are closely related to exports. Cheap foreign labor debates frequently avoid the obvious factor of quality. If labor requires only a series of simple steps to manufacture a good, such as using a machine to sew a shirt, cheap labor-endowed countries will produce a low-cost item of acceptable quality suitable for competition in the worldwide markets. On the other hand, if an operation requires a worker to use complex software programs, such as geographic information systems, to analyze spatially complex land features such as soils and hydrologic flow systems, highly trained professionals are required to do the job at commensurate compensation. The cost of labor is not the only factor to consider. The quality of human capital is another form of endowments. The level of labor productivity combined with worker abilities and pay rates loaded with overhead costs must be combined for the labor cost comparisons between nations to be meaningful. Some pundits argue that a level playing field is needed to balance product trade expenses between other nations and our own. They believe that duties levied against low-cost country products as they enter the U.S. would create this fictitious level playing field. The argument fails to recognize who pays for the field leveling work. Payment comes from the U.S. consumer, taxpayers, and associated import industries. Penalizing our neighbors will not necessarily translate into improving our standard of living. I invite you to take a different angle on this issue. If foreign workers deliver a product to our shorelines at a significantly lower cost than we can do, how would you arrange a trade relationship that will let us take advantage of buying their goods, allowing our domestic workers to be free from the mundane basic labor duties? Our national welfare would increase, and profits would be generated. We do not have to penalize our neighbors in order to take advantage of their productivity. Maintenance of the domestic standard of living through regulating trade barriers often creates an illusion of achieving a balance between the interests of domestic businesses and domestic consumers. We need to remember that tariffs, like any economic weapon, is a stick with two ends. It is domestic consumers who suffer being penalized, paying a higher price for the dutiable goods. Their standard of living reduced due to the imposition of a certain tariff, initially intended to protect consumers. In response, retaliatory tariffs are imposed by a trading partner, creating problems for the other partner's businesses, thus multiplying the negative effect of lowering the welfare for both countries. Economies of the trading world are hopelessly interconnected. Although the name scientific tariff is appealing to some people, the application of it to real-world situations is not. This tariff requires subjective assessments of other countries' production costs to determine if the prices used by the trading partner's production process are unfair. In the context of production costs, as compared to our domestic industry, the tariff is applied with a country's specific industry averages to levy a duty against the subject nation found at fault, one commodity at a time. The domestic producer's characteristics are as variable as foreign producers, and when the scientific tariff is applied, it unequally benefits the most efficient domestic producer and harms the inefficient ones. The final burden is shifted to the shoulders of a consumer, forced to subsidize the business with lower comparative advantage. This tariff disregards the concept of comparative advantage, basis for trade, and erases the gains from trade made possible by international commodity exchange. Another tariff label is the Infant Industry Protective Tariff, intended to shelter a new domestic industry from international competition. A problem is that once the industry receives this protection, it often becomes reliant on it. Politically, it has been difficult to remove them as the industry reaches so-called maturity. Another subjective assessment. Who determines maturity? Like many of the tariff discussions in this chapter, this tariff involves a redistribution of surplus effects from the domestic consumer and foreign producer to the domestic government and infant industry, a reduction in consumption and an increase in prices. A different method recommended is to approach the infant industry situation not with a tax revenue burden, but with a subsidy, grant, or low-cost loan program for producers in the infant industry. This method allocates tax dollars directly to the intended beneficiary, without additional burdens on consumers, penalties on foreign manufacturers, or forward-shifting revenues to the government. In the long term, the matured industry migrates into tax revenue-generating status, benefiting consumers and the government. Sociological justifications of political agendas are commonly served in the mass media. Unfortunately, when these considerations are intertwined with national security arguments in light of potential international conflicts, they fan a public opinion wildfire. There are several non-economic means our government uses to provide national security oversight while using foreign assets. Tariffs are not generally considered a reliable method to ensure national security concerns. As non-biased economists, we can identify economic consequences and costs associated with various alternative reactions, who the beneficiaries are and who the losers are, and identify alternative ways of accomplishing the desired results. In my opinion, fear-mongering through the mass media should not be used as an economic public relations technique.
Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, who's a member of the National Security Council. Mr. Secretary, I know that you have spoken with the president this morning. What is his reaction to the news that North Korea has tested another bomb, they say a hydrogen bomb, but certainly its most powerful explosive in its 10, 12 years of testing?
Well, good morning. I did speak with the president, and it's clear that this behavior is completely unacceptable. We've already started with sanctions against North Korea, but I am going to draft a sanctions package to send to the president for his strong consideration that anybody that wants to do trade or business with them would be prevented from doing trade or business with us. We are going to work with our allies. We'll work with China, but people need to cut off North Korea economically. This is unacceptable behavior.
Does that mean, when you talk about a new trade sanction package, that we're going to be much tougher than we have been so far on Chinese financial institutions, Chinese companies?
We're going to strongly consider everything at this point. And again, I will draft a package for his strong consideration that would go as far as cutting off all trade or other business. And this behavior is unacceptable, and if countries want to do business with the United States, they obviously will be working with our allies and others to cut off North Korea economically.
The protection-biased sector is an established mindset for many entrenched politicians wishing to be reelected, and lobbyists paid by interest groups to promote their agendas. Supporters of protectionist policies come from large industries with substantial workforces facing declining global market shares, and are joined by labor unions representing their workforces and threatened by imports, with related industries and communities linked to the declining industry. Protectionist duties on imports are seen by many people as an acceptable means of shielding an entire industry against foreign competition. On the other side of interests, the free trade biased sector endorses companies working for import-export industries domestically. This group economically benefits from international trade activities and includes domestic retailers, local governments benefiting from increased economic activities and thus sales tax revenues. This interest group also includes the average citizen not directly impacted by the declining industry's loss of market share. Protectionist policies have been justified by affected interests on the basis that they protect domestic employment and wages, help create a level playing field for international trade, equate the cost of imported products with the cost of domestic import competing products, and allow domestic industries to be insulated, at least temporarily, from foreign competition. These conditions can be viewed as sources of demand for protection, while the government responses provide the supply side of the equation. Despite the powerful case for free trade, the United States and the rest of the world are highly protectionist, and always have been. This is because free trade benefits the general public, whereas protectionism benefits a relatively small group of affluent special interests, some of which fund lobbying efforts. The general public is neither well-organized nor well-informed politically, but outspoken special interests are. I guess the squeaky wheel gets the grease.
I'm back in my special shirt on location to talk about international trade. Before we talk about the costs of interfering with international trade, let's make sure we're clear on where the benefits from international trade come from. Let's look back at the graph that we used for a closed economy. Suppose we're in France and we're looking at the market for this product. Do you remember what it's called? That's right, it's a pomelo. We've got a supply curve for pomelos in France and a demand curve for pomelos that tell us how many pomelos the French people want to buy at different prices. Now, if we have a closed market for pomelos, the equilibrium point will be where the supply curve and the demand curve intersect. Here's the price, P star in equilibrium. Here's the quantity, Q star in equilibrium. Well, how much economic value is created in this market? Can you identify the consumer surplus? The consumer surplus is the area above P star and below the demand curve. Where's the producer surplus? The producer surplus is the area below P star and above the blue supply curve. The total economic value created in a closed economy is the area between the demand curve, which represents economic benefit, and above the supply curve, which represents economic cost. Between these two curves is the difference between benefit and cost, or economic value, for this entire market. Suppose now that we introduce international trade. And in the case of the pomelo, we're going to allow France to import this fruit at a lower price from the rest of the world, from outside the market. So let's put in the lower price for pomelos, P sub W, and at this lower price, people in France can buy as many pomelos as they want, and farmers in France can only charge this price if they produce pomelos domestically. With international trade, we think of the red curve as domestic demand, the blue curve as domestic supply, or the cost of producing pomelos domestically. And we realize that all trades that take place have to take place at the world price, PW, because no customer is going to pay a higher price when they can import the good at a lower price from somewhere else. That means the farmers in France cannot charge a higher price. They must charge the world price. At this lower world price, how much consumer surplus is created? See if you can identify the area that represents total consumer surplus when people in France can import pomelos at this low world price. In order to identify the total amount of consumer surplus created, start by finding the total quantity of pomelos demanded at the world price. That's going to be following PW over to the demand curve. Here's the quantity demanded domestically. With people buying this large quantity of pomelos at the price PW, consumer surplus is now the area underneath the demand curve and above PW. That is, it's this entire big triangle. How much producer surplus is now available with international trade? To calculate the total amount of producer surplus, follow PW over to the supply curve to remind yourself what the quantity supplied domestically is. Producers are able to charge PW, and their costs are represented by the height of the blue line, the supply curve. Producer surplus with international trade will be this small triangle that is below the world price and above the cost of making pomelos domestically. What is the total amount of economic value created in this market when international trade is available? It will be the sum of the consumer surplus, this large triangle, and the small triangle of producer surplus. Now, here's a question. Has the total amount of economic value increased because of international trade, or has it not increased? The answer is it has increased, and let's see if we can show why. First of all, notice that as the price falls from P star to PW, as the import opportunity lowers the price of pomelos, the amount of producer surplus created in France for the producers of pomelos domestically, that quantity shrinks, and it shrinks by the amount of this rectangle. The lower price means that a lot of producers in France are going to drop out of the market for pomelos. They're no longer going to produce them. So we have a shrinkage of domestic supply, a reduction in the quantity supplied domestically. Also, because the price is lower, even those farmers that are still in the market, still able to produce pomelos, are earning less revenue. They're making less money. Instead of earning this large price for pomelos, they're getting a small price. So there is a smaller amount of surplus for them, even on the pomelos they're still making. So this entire trapezoid, this area right here, is producer surplus that is no longer available. That is, producer surplus that has been destroyed for French farmers by the fact that imports are now replacing their business. However, the amount of consumer surplus that's created is this very large trapezoid. With the lower price, consumers are ecstatic because they're getting a great bargain, and a lot of consumers are now going to buy pomelos who couldn't afford them or chose not to buy them before. Not only are more customers in the market for pomelos, but even those customers that were buying pomelos at the high price, they're even getting an extra advantage because they're able to get their pomelos at a discount. That is, the price is falling, adding to their consumer surplus. The total increase in consumer surplus is this large trapezoid here. Notice, the large trapezoid, which represents the increased consumer surplus, completely offsets the loss of producer surplus. That is, this small trapezoid lies entirely within the big trapezoid. The net gain for the economy in France, the net gain is the area of this triangle, the triangle that's below the old equilibrium down to the import price. You can think of this triangle as equal to the quantity of imports multiplied by the difference between the old price and the new price, multiplied by 1/2. That is, this rectangle represents the gains from trade. The difference between the additional consumer surplus, or the benefit that consumers get from buying low-price pomelos, and the loss to producers of losing a market. If you subtract the lost producer surplus from the gain in consumer surplus, you get the gain from trade. That is what's left over. And it's always going to be positive.